Hello, one and all. LevDev here, also known as PhD Hansen on Twitter, and welcome to Top Deck Thoughts, which we'll be talking about our top 10 cards of Bloomburrow. Personally, Bloomburrow just looks like such a whimsy of a set, just so freaking adorable. Just seeing all the cute little critters having their little kind of like tea, going on adventures, facing the elemental calamities, and having just there's just so much cute little flavor in this set. It's just so freaking adorable. Like, for Pete's sake, the animated trailer for this is just it's so freaking cute. But I will say, there are some pretty silly cards in this set, and I got 10 that I think it should be kept an eye on without a sweat. Before we get started though, some honorary mentions. One I will say, without a doubt, is definitely Innkeeper's Talent. Innkeeper's Talent just kind of looks generally innocent enough. It just kind of looks like your basic counter synergy shenanigans, essentially. Until you kind of realize, with the leveling up, being able to protect your permanents with counters on them. That includes stuff like Planeswalkers, or like any enchantments that have like the variety of different counters that are in the history of Magic in general. I mean, heck, even now cards with finality counters on them now pretty much gives your stuff Ward 1. But also, when we get to that last ability, that is essentially the counter portion of Doubling Season. In Doubling Season, with a couple of very good Planeswalkers, like, I don't know, the Phyrexian version of Vraska, for example, yeah, that's pretty much, if you have the Doubling Season online, it's Innkeeper's Talent, you pretty much have an OTK, which is kind of nuts. Who thought the Innkeeper was actually good with Super Friends? Who would have thought? The other card we'll also put on the honorary mention as well is Hugs. I think Hugs is going to be one of those cards that's going to be kind of slept on originally until people start realizing you just throw this in Team or Ramp. Very solid card, just stompy 5/5 in general, but if you get to the late game and draw them, you essentially then can pump ads into the Impulse Draw, which is going to be very relevant, and even if you play them as a 4-drop, just being able to play additional lands is just very nice in general in those type of Team or Ramp decks. So yeah, and at worst, these are the same decks that you're going to play Astro Cornucopia, so you're just going to be gaining 2 life, which, not bad for a 5/5 with Trample that allows you to play additional lands, technically, so who would have thought? Anyways, now let's get to the top 10 of the set of Bloomburrow, shall we? Oh, and before we start, no, we're not going to do the cute fiend where I turn into a little critter, since yes, technically in the lore, if you go to Bloomburrow, you turn into a critter of some sort to adapt to the environment. We don't have the budget for that. I have a Ko-Fi, so enough said there. Anyway, top 10 now. Bada beep, bada boop.
Number 10.
Number 10 on this list, and this is one where I kind of had to debate whether or not if I was going to put this on the 11th spot, either in the honorary mentions, but I decided to put it on the 10th spot, and that would be Jigra. A very big elemental Gagari kitten. This card is actually pretty freaking solid due to a variety of variables. I mean, first of all, it's just a cat that makes every other creature into a food, which, granted, I would say that would be more of a dog, since dogs usually try to eat everything, but cats, I guess giant cats that are in an environment with a bunch of cute little critters will try to eat everything, all the critters, which, yeah, a little bit dark there, I'm not gonna lie, but still, nevertheless, there is actually a lot of cute synergies of making all your other creatures, as well as your opponent's creatures, into artifacts. There's stuff like Shadow Spree, where you can initially use Shadow Spree to destroy all your opponent's artifacts, which are going to be quote-unquote their creatures. There's also stuff that if you want to make your own stuff into food artifacts, you could do some cute little synergies, such as, for example, I think the cutest one I could think of is if you go into Sultai, you can play stuff like Simulacrum Synthesizer, and then now essentially any creature that is 3 mana or more that, while Jigra is on the battlefield, now is an artifact, which now will pretty much synergize with Synthesizer. But there's even the cute infinite combo shenanigans that people are already figuring out with this card, with stuff like Camilla, which didn't make the list, even though it's a good squirrel for Chatterpage shenanigans. basically people figured out that, oh, if you found a way to constantly sack, which we have a bunch of sack outlets in Standard at the moment, you can essentially sack another creature other than Camilla while both Camilla and Jigra is on the battlefield. Make sure you don't sack Jigra, of course. Then, essentially what happens is Camilla's going to see that and be like, oh, I'll just essentially make a new squirrel token since somebody sacked the food token. And you kind of see where this is going. You pretty much can do it like with any aristocratic payoff. There's even a new talent in the game, which essentially makes it when anytime you sacrifice a permanent at its second level, you mill 2 cards, or you make your target opponent mill 2 cards. So yeah, basically, infinite sacks make your opponent mill out their whole deck, essentially. There's also talk about this potentially in Pioneer, going infinite with Cauldron Familiar even. So with that, I think my number 10, Without the Sweat, is the really big and scary kitten that can make anything into food, which is something to chew on. Number 9 on this list, and this one is kind of like a cute little bunny that actually shows off the offspring mechanic, and that is Warren Warleader. Now, for those who don't know what the mechanic is, it's pretty much what I like to call baby kicker, essentially. You know, actually, on postal expression, calling it baby kicker is probably not the goodest idea. Let's call it something else. It's essentially token kicker. Let's go with that. Essentially, the basic premise is what happens is, once you play the offspring cost for a card while you're casting it, when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 token copy of that creature, which the flavor is, oh, it's the creature's kid, essentially, is the basic flavor winner there. And Warren Warleader is probably one of the more scarier variations of this card, mostly because I feel like Offspring in general are mostly going to be good for like aggro to go wide decks in general, and this creature just provides really relevant modes. You either with the attack trigger, and note, you don't have to attack with the Warleader to get, or its Offspring token to get the attack trigger. And do note that if the Offspring trigger is cast and you get your token, both of them are going to see an attack trigger, and you get 2 attack triggers, which is either making a cute little 1/1 bunny that's going to be attacking, or I guess if you're doing Divine Visitation shenanigans, you could also make it just an attacking angel, so keep that in mind, or just buff up your team. So either you can essentially have the versatility of attacking with 2 tokens, or buff your already go wide board state by 2 attack, which is pretty good. There's some board states that Overrun is a pretty solid card, and this is kind of like a mini Overrun. Plus, also keep in mind with tokens, there's always all of the token manipulator cards that allows you to double, triple your tokens, which then makes Warleader into a very scary card. And that's why it's number 9 on my list. This bunny is very scary. Ironically, number 8, since we were just talking about it with Jigra, and we just have to put it on the list in general, Scavenger's Talent. Overall, I think Scavenger's Talent is just a ridiculously one of the more powerful talents of the set. With the exception of Innkeeper's Talent, I think they're kind of tied, if I'm being honest. But just a very good card. Just being able to, whenever your creature dies, you get a food token out of it. That's actually not bad. Sure, it triggers only once, but there's a bunch of synergies in the set that you can use food tokens for, and food in general has been overall a relatively good mid-range mechanic. Then there's also the factor that essentially when you get to the second mode, as stated before, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you or target opponent will mill 2 cards. We already talked about the Jigra shenanigans, how that's an infinite mill combo with the right circumstances with the Camilla and all that stuff. But even then, there's a lot of cards in general that allows you to sacrifice a lot of stuff. Like, heck, for Pete's sakes, we had a spell literally in Thunders of Elden, pretty much Outlaws of Thunder Junction, that basically allows you to sacrifice as many permanents you want and draw as many cards. So all you really have to do is just go do that spell, sacrifice, I don't know, like 5 of your lands, maybe even 3 of your permanents, and then mill your opponent 16 cards. Like, that's probably not going to happen, but that is something, a line you have to keep in mind, potentially. I mean, heck, I could see that being something silly to maybe happen in a Pro Tour or something like that. It sounds like one of those type of plays. So still, and of course the last mode is actually pretty decent as well. Yes, it has the finality counter on it, but a reanimator spell is a reanimator spell, and yet again, you have to keep in mind this is a reanimator spell that you just have to sacrifice 3 permanents, which then when second level is up, you're essentially going to either self-mill yourself for 6 cards to find something to reanimate, or mill your opponent 6 cards, which is not bad. Very versatile card, and that's why Scavenger's Talent is my number 8 card on the list. Number 7, this is one where you could kind of jokingly say all the mice in the set are pretty good. Like, the mice aggro deck is actually a pretty legit deck, but if I had to choose one mice to be put on this list, for me, I'm going to choose the Manifold Mouse, mostly because this card's kind of silly. Being able to give you a choice of targeting a creature and give it either any mouse, essentially a choice of either trample or double strike. That's pretty good. Definitely in the mice deck, that's essentially... You're essentially having a turn 4 Ember Cleave. And it's not an equipment, it's just 2 mice, essentially. I need to use the plural there. 2 mice that essentially allows you to build up your board state, which is pretty silly. I think this card is actually very solid. There's some cards that giving a double strike is kind of absurd. Especially if you have any creatures with, like, or find a way to give a creature Death Touch, stuff like that. We all know the trample Death Touch trick, where you only have to deal 1 damage to your creature for the opponent's creature to die, and then you can deal the rest of the damage to the opponent, yada yada yada, etc, etc. So, yeah, with that, my number 7 on the list, without a sweat, is Manifold Mouse. Number 6 on this list, and this one we're going to cheat just a little bit. We only cheat like 2 times in this top 10. And that is the whole cycle of seasons. Now, for those who haven't seen this cycle yet, it's a whole monocolored cycle of season of blank. And essentially what it is, it's their very powerful modal spells, where essentially you get 5 quote-unquote pawns, and then you can choose how you want to essentially more or less spin those pawns to make the spell go from whatever you want to be. Whether it's Season the Bold, where you essentially can make up to 5 treasures if you use the 1 paw 5 times, or even stuff like Season the Lost, where you can like use 5 paws to like Edict 5 times, or maybe Edict 3 times, and then essentially make it where you can do the 2 paw mode, where you draw cards equal to the number of creatures that you had to sacrifice for creatures who died that turn, essentially. And the fact that I'm mentioning all this kind of versatility kind of shows the power of this. Even stuff like the Season of the Gathering's very good, because nevertheless, that could just be a very finisher if you have a wide enough board state, giving all your creatures just trample and vigilance. But even then, it's also just versatile if you just decide to spend 3 paws to essentially then use 2 paws to buff up either 2 or 1 of the creatures twice and then draw cards equal to your highest power creature. I mean, we played commander cards that are essentially that designed in general. Personally, my favorite, though, is probably the Season of the Weaving. This one's just kind of like a cute design for Gimbal, personally, because it'll make a token copy of something. And also the factor that it could just be a board wipe where you bounce all everybody's non-token permanents, which for a token deck is very nifty. And also, at worst, it could also just be 6 mana, draw 6 cards, which, it's 6 mana, draw 6 cards. That's a pretty good rate, I'm not gonna lie. So yeah, number 6, without a sweat, is the Season Cycle. Number 5 on this list, and this one, I think we had to give the honorary mention to some rats, which we did get some pretty good rats in this set, I'm not gonna lie, but if I had to choose one for the list, it's probably going to be our Rat Kalidas, as I like to jokingly call it, aka Friend the Relentless. This card is just silly. The factor is, you just get a pretty good Ward 2 threat, and also anytime you remove your opponent's creatures, they get exiled. That's just, some decks will perfectly just love that as a tech card in general against graveyard shenanigans. But wait, there's more. Once pretty much every instep, depending on how many creatures your opponents get, pretty much creatures that your opponents control get exiled, you make that many Relentless Rat tokens, which for those who don't know, Relentless Rats is a pretty silly card, not to mention that this is a very buffed Relentless Rat, since no matter what, they're still a 1/1, and they get buffed for every rat that's on the battlefield, which, as people who have already played rats in Standard knows, there's a lot of ways to make a ton of rats. So, yeah. I think this is one where if a Grixis control deck, or even like a Demir control deck, might even just play this card. And of course, Grixis Rats might try it with the new Wick card and stuff like that. But for the Relentless, very scary card, and I do think it's going to be a very popular card, in my personal opinion. And that's why it's my number 5 card of the set.
Number 4.
Number 4 on this list, and this one is, without a sweat, the Luma. A very good bear. Essentially, it's Splendid Reclamation as an ETB and attack trigger. That's very good, especially in the Aftermath Analysts mill a bunch of card decks and then try to essentially get all the lands from your graveyard to do a significant ramp. That is very strong. And of course, in Commander, if you're playing landfall type shenanigans, you probably are going to play Roomland. Not much to say here. It's just a good bear that if you're doing land shenanigans, you're probably going to play this card. No sweat about it. Some may say that for the landfall decks, it's going to be the bare necessities. Okay, that was a little corny, but hey, it's my list. Number 3 on this list, and this is one where I'm going to cheat again and talk about a whole cycle of cards. And this is the monocolored, what I'm going to call the Valley cycle. In this set, we have a bunch of cards that are called Valley, fill the blank here. And mostly they are actually really cool, kind of like creature, multiple creature kindred mattered styled cards. They're actually a very fascinating design. And I personally love this because it allows us to actually kind of test, like, sometimes when we get into sets like this where there's multiple creature kindreds, we feel like we want to go into one specific kindred, like, oh, we want to make the bunny deck, we want to make the bat deck, we want to make the frog deck, etc., etc. I mean, for Pete's sake, I was guilty as charged and being like, I want to make the Ultra deck, you know, stuff like that. And what's kind of cool is that this whole cycle, in general, actually kind of provides some interesting incentive to actually either go multiple kindred, or even just essentially brew entirely around these type of cards, and then just trying to incorporate the creatures that get benefit from the quote-unquote Valley card. Like, for example, the one that people are probably going to play around day 1 is Valley Flamecaller. Just a solid free lizard that essentially makes it where your lizard, your mouse, your otters, and your raccoons, essentially whenever they deal damage, will deal 1 more damage. And that's a very strong ability in general, especially with mice having the ability to go wide, maybe even otters potentially. Wizards had... not wizards, lizards. Yeah. We're going to be making that mistake probably more than once. But yeah, lizards in general have a bunch of ways that they can deal damage. We're going to talk about that later, actually. But there's even stuff like the Valley Mightcaller, where it's a solid frog, which, yeah, you're going to be playing in the frog deck, because you're going to be bouncing frogs in general, and then putting them back on the battlefield, which buffs up this Champion of the Pariah variant. But there is just also the factor that you can just play this as rabbits and just play Hop to it, which makes free rabbit tokens, and then essentially you just buff up with free counters on Valley Mightcaller. There's even Valley Questcaller, which essentially anytime you play the respective creature types that it cares about, you scry 1, as well as just being a good lord in general for 2 mana, which is kind of absurd. And my personal favorite, which is the Valley Floodcaller, which essentially gives you more like a Jeskai Ascendancy variant, which with Convoke still in Standard thanks to March of the Machines, is kind of like a fun brew around, I'm not going to lie. And even in general, just being able to get a +1/+1 buff whenever you do your kind of like combat tricks or removal or anything, very powerful ability. So yeah, I kind of like that they legit put this design in the set. It encourages the theme of Bloomburrow in general, which is all these animal critters working together for the common good, essentially. I mean, there is actually a card called For the Common Good, which, now I think of it, I'm kind of surprised that card didn't make the set, since that's mostly my jam of making a bunch of tokens or something. We're just gonna say it's like in the mid, like late honorary mentions, let's put it like that, okay. But you kind of get my point. All animals pretty much helping out together and just essentially bettering the valley, which kind of a flavor win, if I'm not gonna lie. Oh, and also Valley Rockcaller is just going to see play just in generally any go wide deck because life gain is just very good and life drain. So yeah, without a sweat, the whole Valley cycle makes the number 3 on the list without a sweateroni to the pepperoni.
Number 2.
Number 2 on this list, and this is probably one of the better lizards that are coming from the set for standard as well as other formats, and that is the Iridescent Vine Lasher. Or as my personal nickname for it, and forgive me for the choice of words here, but personally I just call it the little
Lizard.
Yeah, the Vine Lasher is probably one of the more annoying one-drops I've seen in quite a bit. Now, we gotta get for the whole shenanigans of why this is pretty good. Now, for people who are aware of their card history, they might remember, wait, didn't Zendikar Rising gave us a 4-mana variant of this card, essentially? And the answer is yes. But, as we learn with any constructed format, there's a difference between 4 mana and 1 mana. Also, there's also a difference between 1 mana that then also on turn 4, you can play the 1 mana Fiend, and then with the Offspring mechanic, just essentially... No, you can even do this on turn 3. Yeah, turn 3... you can make 2 of these little annoying buggers, and then essentially anytime you play a land, which is going to be the most common thing you're going to do in Magic in general, you get to ping your opponent a point of damage, which doesn't sound like much, but like anyone who ever known or had been a college kid that has not did well with their finances and decided to try to get like Starbucks every day or some shit like that, it's one of those things like, oh, $3 doesn't seem like much, oh, a ping doesn't seem like that much. Until you realize when you do it every day, or in Magic, when you essentially are constantly playing lands, that damage adds up. And there's sometimes where you can do upwards of 7 to 14 damage with the annoying bugger. And we're not even talking about the factor that in internal formats that play fetch lands, that's essentially now your fetch land, essentially now the Vine Lasher just does shocks every turn. Potentially every turn, I should say. As well as in Standard, since you're targeting the opponent with the effect, we should also mention the factor that essentially this also, due to Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we have a bunch of essentially Crime Matter cards where essentially if you target your opponent do something, you would get an additional synergy with certain cards. This card now actually helps you by doing that. As well as within this set in general, there's a bunch of cards that essentially if you deal your opponent a point of damage, you get an extra benefit, whether it's getting a mana boost, or either just essentially getting a counter on your lizards, or heck, even that Valley Flamecaller. Now those shocks, essentially if we decide to play like a Fabled Passage, which is in this set, Valley Flamecaller have the little Vine Lasher, and now you're pretty much you're dealing 4 points of damage. You kind of see why I say this little card is going to be one of the more annoying cards? Yeah, there's the reason why it's the number 2 on my list. This card, it's cute at the moment, but I can see myself being very salty from it, and like, this is like one of those cards that you would like, you can tell how good it is, and you can also tell that it's going to be a card that within like, well now since Standard is 3-year rotation, this is going to be a card that I can see myself in 3 years being like, yeah, I can't wait for this card to rotate out of Standard. And that is why the Little Vine Lasher, or the Little Beep, is my number 2 card of the set.
Number 1.
And my number 1 card of the set. This one, I have to admit, it kind of caught me by surprise until I actually read the card and actually played with it during the early access. But without a doubt, my number 1 card of Bloomburrow is actually Rao, the Crackling Wit. Now, this card kind of seems innocent at first when you just read it. It's just like, oh, +1, make an auto token. The -2, just, oh, you just draw 3 cards, discard 2. Oh, that seems fine. And then you get to the ultimate, which is like, oh, your instant and sorcery speeds now have Storm. Wait, what? Now, for those who don't know, Storm is a ridiculously powerful mechanic. Even some would consider ban-worthy of a mechanic, to the point that when we talk about mechanics that we don't want to see yet again in Standard and such, and when they consider essentially mechanics that are returning, it's literally called the Storm Scale. Yeah, Storm is a very ridiculously powerful mechanic. It sees play constantly in Legacy and such. Now, some of you, very well-astute players, will probably be like, oh, you shouldn't be distracted by the ultimate. You shouldn't really consider that you get to the ultimate. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. Well, wait. We gotta talk about the static effect. Which the static effect on Ral is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, instant, sorcery, planeswalker, enchantment, battle, etc., you essentially now get a loyalty counter. So, you know how Storm in general, you just want to cast a couple of instant sorcery spells? Now that essentially buffs up Ral by essentially buffing up the ultimate, and then can get you easily to the ultimate. Like, during the early access, it was surprising how easily I got to the ultimate on some games, I'm not gonna lie. It's one of those things where once you realize that anytime you play kind of like control magic in general, you just do an additional plus to Ral, it turns out then to be a very solid card in general. And even the other modes are just pretty relevant. Making a token that can block or even be aggressive with the prowess, very good. It's kind of like Jaya from Dominaria United with... Actually, both of them are actually relatively silly now with their technical ultimate and such, but Ral actually getting to the ultimate is a little bit realistic. So yeah, and also, yes, of course, we gotta talk about the factor that Ral essentially came to Bloomburrow and became an otter, which is an absolute freaking flavor win. If you don't understand why this is a flavor win, just ask around, someone will explain it to you, but it's an absolute delight. It's still one of my favorite cards to play with. I like playing with Ral. It's a fun design. And of course, yes, if you do get to the ultimate, there are some instant sorcery spells that having Storm is ridiculously absurd. Whether it's like something modest as like a Shock, or Lightning Helix, or, I don't know, Breach the Multiverse. So yeah, without a doubt, Ral, Crackling Wit, is my #1 card from Bloomburrow. And I hope you all had enjoyed my 2 cents on the set. Like I said, this set has actually looked pretty legit. A lot of cool designs, and I've been even seeing through the first week of Bloomburrow Standard, a lot of cool brews are being brewed with it. So, I mean, heck, for Pete's sakes, I talked about the freaking Innkeeper Vraska OTK combo. Like, a lot of people are doing a lot of cool brews with this set, and it's just legit fun. It's a very fun standard set. It's a very good set to get started in standard. That's my personal opinion. So, nevertheless, I hope you all have a lovely day. As they say, hip hip hooray. Bada beep, bada boop.